Good morning, everybody. Let's see, we're missing actually quite a few people this morning. Oh, wait, we have the field trip. Does anybody else know? Are people down with the flu? Okay. Sorry? Yeah. Let's not talk about that. That's not a good thought. All right. They say that it's like a third of the world is likely to come down with it. A third of the global population is likely to come down with COVID-19, which is the name of coronavirus. Anyways, all right, so today we're talking about children. One of the things about design, as a landscape architect, as an architect, as an engineer, is that when you do work for children, that's the best. Because they are so receptive to most of the things that we do. And you get to have a lot of fun with it. You get to be very, very creative. You don't have to follow all of these kinds of rules around how many steps to the closest elevator and how many emergency exits do we need and how many, we have a lot more kind of open capacity in terms of what we do for children. But one of the interesting things is how our understanding of children and children's development has changed over the years. So way back in the day, back in the early 1900s, we changed how we think about children. Up until that point, we had thought about children as small adults. So it's a very different way of thinking about kids than we have today. So that is how we were able to have them in factories doing things like making carpets and making clothing and doing all these things because they had teeny tiny little fingers and teeny tiny little arms, and they could reach their arms and their hands into places that adults couldn't. And so we saw them as these great workers that you could just tell what to do and they would do whatever you said, and they had these particular skills that were very handy. And in the early 1900s, all of a sudden we started saying, wait, these people are not just small adults. They have different characteristics and they need to be treated differently. And that's when we started thinking about children and play as a way of learning, as a way of understanding the world around us, as having a particular role in terms of the development of children. So make sure when you think about children and you think about the spaces that we create for them and the tools that we create for them, all of this thinking around children as not being adults is actually relatively new in our development. So, all right, so let's talk. So a lot of these images are from Chicago. This is a play area at the Chicago Botanical Garden. This is a particular favorite of mine in terms of a children's play area. You can actually see here there's mounds in the background, and the children run up and down the mounds. Up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. It's a very simple design. The children really love it. It's interesting because there's a design at the University of Michigan. It's either University of Michigan or Michigan State. It's one of the Michigans, where they have smaller versions of these, and nobody ever uses them. But they're university students. Mostly, we don't go up and down hills, up and down, up and down, up and down, right? There's kind of an age range for that. So it's interesting that we look at these kinds of things and we think they're interesting designs, but they're very much something that needs to be implemented for a particular age range. All right, so let's talk about it. So play is how children collect information about the world around them. And that is something that we've really started to realize in only about the last 50 years. Before that, we thought play was a way for kids to waste time. It was something they used to fill time between their periods of productivity. That when they were learning things, that was when, if they were sitting in a classroom behind a desk, that they were learning something, and if they were outside or playing with their toys, they weren't learning something. And this whole idea of understanding that children collect information regardless of what they're doing, and play is one of the ways to do that, and that the information they collect is different and also valuable as the information they collect behind a desk, is an important understanding that we've developed. So they collect that information, they integrate it with their previous experience, and then they repeat it to see if things happen the same way again. So they take a piece of information, this is my understanding, and they say, okay, have I had this type of experience before that has had this type of outcome? Yes or no. If it's yes, they say, okay, there's a pattern here. And then they say, okay, if I do it again, is it going to have the same outcome? So that's the whole thing of like putting something in their mouths or doing, banging things and banging them 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 and, the whole repetitive thing with kids. That's part of the process of learning, right? Is they want to try it again and again and again to test it out. All right, so we're going to go through a series of theories today. It's part of the thing with children is the theories have evolved as our understanding of children have evolved. So one of the first theories that we had was right around that period when we started thinking of children as separate human beings and not as small adults, was this idea of surplus energy. So part of the idea behind parks in their initial in their initial formation, in the initial way that they functioned and they looked, was that they were a way to keep people out of trouble. So back in the day, back in the early 1900s, we said, okay, so we're going to give people a half a day off. Wow, weren't we generous? We said, we're going to give you a half a day off, but we were concerned that people would get into trouble. We were concerned that if you gave them a half a day off, they would become criminals and they would do bad things. And so we said, okay, we need to keep people busy during that half a day off. And so we created these spaces for people to spend their leisure time. And the spaces were highly structured. If you look at those early parks, they were very square. They had programs. So you didn't just go to the park to hang out and do whatever. You went to the park and you had a class that you were taking in something. You were playing badminton. You had someone who was teaching you. Everything was very structured. Even the play areas were very structured. They were very organized. And the idea behind this idea, not just of children's play, but also of adults' play, was that you wanted to burn off people's surplus energy so they wouldn't get themselves into trouble. So the surplus energy theory is about that, is about saying, okay, we're going to design things so that children can burn off their energy so that they only have what they absolutely need available to them. Any surplus energy that they would otherwise use for criminal pursuits, we're going to burn out using play areas. So, and that is the idea behind the place, what we call the play structure. So the most common thing that we find in parks that's directed at children is a play structure. And play structures are very much designed as tools to burn off children's energy. So when you have someone who says, oh, let's go and play on the play structure, let's get the kids out to the play structure, they are wanting to burn off children's energy. That is the primary function of this. It does not teach creativity. It does not teach problem solving. It does not teach any kind of cognitive or social skills. It teaches kids to burn off their energy, right? So that's why parents like them, because the kids come home and they're tired, right? So surplus energy theory is this idea that you need this much energy to survive, and any energy that you have above and beyond that, you're going to burn off at a play structure so that when you go home, you'll stay out of trouble. I basically use it with my dogs. Same idea, right? You take them out, you tire them out, and then they're less likely to chew on the carpet and the pillows. Although that's not actually the case with my youngest dog. But anyways, there is nothing that makes her less likely to chew on the carpet and the pillows. But, all right, so the second theory, so that first theory, surplus energy, is this idea that people have more energy than they need and you have to burn it off, otherwise they're going to get themselves into trouble. Then, and that was the dominant theory until like the 1970s. That was the dominant theory for a long time. And as you guys know, there are still play structures everywhere, right? It's our go-to easy way of saying, bam, we put something in this park for a child, right? It's like, okay, what are we going to do for the kids? Oh, pop in a play structure, good, we're done, right? So relaxation theory is the opposite of surplus energy theory. So this we started seeing coming in the 70s, and we said, okay, actually play is a way to replenish your energy, And so your energy is taken up by work, and it's a way to restore the energy that you have lost. So if you think about it, there's this kind of thinking, even in teachers, like elementary school teachers, you think about it, kind of half of your elementary school teachers are like, oh my goodness, get those kids out for recess, they have way too much energy. And half of the elementary school teachers are like, oh my goodness, get those kids out for recess, they can't focus, right? They need to reboot, they need to recharge. They're too tired to learn. And so that's what this is, right? It's like, okay, we need to replenish our energy. It's been used up by the work effort that we've been doing. All right. So a third theory is this idea of pre-exercise. And this is as we started getting into this idea of play. Instead of just being about physicality and about burning energy, it's about saying, okay, play is a way for children to prepare for being adults. It's a way for them to develop cognitively and emotionally. So pre-exercise theory is a theory that says when children play, they are trying out behaviors that they're going to use as adults. So they are trying out things to say, okay, is this what I should be doing? No. Is this what I should be doing? No. Is this what I should be doing? So there's 3 types of play that they use to try out these behaviors that they're going to need as adults. The first play is games with rules. So you think about that, sports and things that we have rules associated with, card games, board games, soccer, baseball, things that have very clear rules. It's about trying out the games and trying out how rules work and how you have to behave within that setting. The second category is rough and tumble play. So when kids wrestle on the ground, when they goof around, jump on the bed, fall off the bed, crack their head, right? That kind of thing, that's a different type of play. That's exploring what physically they are capable of, how their bodies work, and what it will take for them to get hurt. This is a problem. This issue of rough and tumble play is a problem because a lot of the things that we do these days are designed to try and stop kids from getting hurt. And one of the key functions of play is for kids to learn how to get hurt and how to walk away from that. So if you take away children's capacity to get hurt, they never learn what their own boundaries are. They don't learn, oh, I can do this and that's not going to hurt me, but if I try the same thing with a car, the car may roll over my foot. And so they need to learn, how does my body physically interact with the world around me, but also what is my capacity for being hurt. Learning that you can get hurt and survive that is an important skill, right? Kids who are terrified to do anything because they might get hurt are kids that cannot function in the adult world, right? You need kids who can say, okay, yes, this is a scary environment, but I will be fine. I can maneuver my way through this scary environment. There is a person over there with a bat. I need to learn that just because someone has a bat does not mean that I am necessarily, being threatened, right? So taking away rough and tumble play is a big problem. So for example, when I was in practice, I had to do a play area, and we had to do a fully accessible play area, which means it had to be handicap accessible for children who had hearing impairments, sight impairments, all of those things. And so if we go back to this image. So if you can imagine needing to build a play structure like this, but having to make it handicap accessible, fully handicap accessible, right? So you have to then build ramps that go all the way back and forth, right? You have to build the ramps so that you can get them all the way up here, and then build ramps so they can get all the way up here. So you end up with this kind of play structure that's like an island in a whole series of ramps, because the ramps have to be 8%, give or take. And so you end up having very long ramps. And then, of course, you have to have equivalent experiences for kids who have mobility issues. So things like this, that a child with a mobility issue can't do, you would then have a supplemental exercise where there would be some kind of similar experience for them. So you end up with a play structure surrounded by ramps and different variations of the same exercise. So you have a lot of repetitiveness. So I actually should put a photo of this project in this lecture. So we put all these ramps in, and the railings were 32 inches, which is what they were supposed to be. So anytime you have a ramp, if it's a handicap ramp, if it's higher than a certain distance in terms of how much the fall on the side is, right? So if people can fall off of it in any way, shape, or form, you have to have a railing. And so we had the railing, and then the issue with railings is that the space between the rails, the up and down parts, has to be within a certain range, and it's a very specific range. It has to be wider than a child's head and narrower than a child's head, right? Like it has to be either too skinny for a small child to get their head into, or too wide for a small child to get their head caught in, right? So there's this very specific range in terms of the rails and how wide apart the rails can be. And so it was the 32 inches, if I remember correctly. It was 32 inches high, which was specified. And so we had all of the drawings, we had it all worked out. And I took it to the people who needed to approve it, and they looked at that 32 inches and they said, well, but kids are going to climb on that, and then they're going to jump off and they're going to get hurt. And I was like, okay, so what are you proposing? And they were like, well, we can make it 40 inches. And I was like, okay, at what point are the children in jail looking, because at 40 inches, that railing is taller than the majority of these children, right? So these children are coming up to this play structure, basically going through an experience where everything that they're seeing is through railing. And then the other issue was, I said, you make it 40 inches high, now it's a 40-inch high thing for them to jump off of. You can make it 48 inches high, and now it's a 48-inch high thing for them to jump off of. It doesn't matter how high you make it. If they want to jump off of it, they are going to jump off of it. And so then it just becomes this kind of liability issue, right? It's like, okay, how high do you have to make it before you can say to people, we did our due diligence, and this child was just a crazy monkey that was insisting on jumping off of something. So that's part of the issue here with this rough and tumble play, is that, for example, children need to climb on things and jump off, and maybe they'll break their leg, or maybe they'll sprain their ankle, and maybe they'll cry for a minute, and that is a good thing. It's good for kids to get hurt. We don't want them to die. We don't want them to crack their heads open, but we want them to fall and hurt themselves, because then they learn not to climb on the tall thing, right? And they learn not to climb on the tall thing when they're in the middle of a play area, when there isn't a car on the other side, right? Or the tall thing isn't a balcony with a garbage can, 3 stories below it, right? So you want them to learn these things in a play area where the risks are moderate rather than being extreme. So the third area is this kind of imitative and dramatic play, and this is one of those areas that's really getting neglected these days, as we're as we're losing things like drama and theater and art and dance from our schools. That kids are not learning how to be innovative and how to play and pretend to be other people, or how to pretend to be, I'm a cowgirl, I'm a bronco rider, I'm a librarian. Those are important skills to learn. That ability to put yourself into someone else's position and break down how they would act in a given situation and imitate that is a very important social skill. And we're losing this. All right, so let's talk about the stages of play. So the children as they play go through different stages. If you think about it, think about your niece or your nephew, or your younger cousin. As a child, they go through the phase of, staring at things as they go around in circles, to the phase of sucking on everything and chewing on everything, to the phase of banging everything, right? There's very definitely phases that they go through. So the way we break it out in terms of the theory is we say the first stage is sensory motor. So sensory, being sensory like with an I, instead of a Y, because of course we're, have to be all fancy pants. So sensory, motor being movement, okay? So in this case, motor means to move. Anything you see, when we're talking about play, if you see the word motor, it means movement. So sensory motor is about moving and sensing the world around you. So this is very much about physical activity. This is children running and jumping and leaping and crawling and moving through the landscape, moving through the building, moving through the space that they're in and experiencing it, experiencing roughness and smoothness and cold and hot and all of those kinds of things. So that's the first stage. That's where they start, right? That's where they start watching things go around in circles, putting things in their mouths, banging things to see what noises they're going to make, right? So the second stage of play is what we call symbolic play. And that's this idea of make-believe. I'm going to be a fireman today, right? And this idea of I can be a princess, or I can be the king, or I can sit on the toilet and I can have my throne, which is the toilet, and I can have my scepter, which is the plunger, and I can have my toilet paper, which is my crown, right? So they can then take things that are literal symbols of something and they can turn them into symbolic things of something else. So they turn the plunger into the scepter, they turn the toilet into the throne. I actually had a theater piece where I had to sit on a toilet and pretend it was a throne. So for some reason, that one's in my head right now. But anyways, so this ability to pretend and to not just have a plunger be a plunger, but also have a plunger be a scepter, that ability to apply that kind of innovation over top of something, right? So it's not just having a chair and making a chair into a throne, right? It's having other things. It's turning a garbage can upside down and turning that into a throne. It's sitting on a lawnmower and turning that into a throne, or sitting on a vacuum cleaner and turning that into a throne, right? So it's about transforming things that don't normally have a particular function, that being to sit on it, and turning it into something else, right? So you have to think of it as one step removed. So to go from a chair to a throne is not a step removed. That's a literal transposition. It's just another type of chair. But when children start to say, oh, I could sit on the vacuum cleaner, and that's like a throne. It's really high in the top, and it's low in the bottom, and it's got a scepter attached to it, right? So kids have that ability to develop that ability to flip in terms of their minds. And you can see how, for a lot of children, that's getting lost, right? If you just watch TV, you do not learn that skill. You do not learn how to transform something that you're looking at into something else from watching TV or playing video games. All right, the third is those games with rules. And that is important because we start to learn conventions. So we start to learn ideas like compromise and negotiating, right? Like the always fun joy of playing with your little niece or nephew and playing Uno with them, and the rules change halfway through the game and you're like, wait a second, no. You told me that I didn't get a point if I did that, and now you're saying you get a point if you do that, right? So that process of saying you don't get to change the rules halfway through the game, right? And the process of saying just because you're smaller doesn't mean you get to win, right? Just because you're cuter doesn't mean I'm going to give you bonus points, right? And the interactions, the fact that you don't get to just drop your cards down and storm away, or you lose your temper, or do any of those kinds of things. So play is how we learn these things. And that's how come we have an issue now where you see the whole idea of First Child California, where we have an issue with children who have not learned, especially these bottom two. And that's what First Child California is directed at. It's directed at saying you need to take time with your children. Because if you just stick them in front of the television, they do not learn either of these things. Eventually they learn some version of the first because they have to move through the world, right? So that is a requirement. But without something like First Child California, where you're reading to children and playing with children, and they get to mimic you, they get to bounce things off of you, they get to lose their temper, and you get to say, no, that's not appropriate, and this is why. Without those kinds of interactions, you lose children's ability to deal with things that are not as they seem and rules that are not written down. Okay? Everybody with me? All right. Okay. Now we get into a little bit of fancy terminology, but you can't really talk about children in theory without talking about Piaget. So we will talk a little tiny bit about Piaget. So this particular theorist divided children up by age group. But that being said, these are just ranges. So for some children, they may move faster through some stages than others and slower through other stages. So the first stage up to age 2 is supposed to be that sensory motor stage. So that learning how your body moves, right? So you think about it, up to age 2, that's when you're learning how to walk. That's hopefully at the age of 2 when you stop putting your hand on the stove. It's when you stop hopefully putting every single thing that you find at the dentist's office into your mouth, right? And for the most part, you're not actually doing what we call internalized thinking. So you're not thinking about why or should I do this or any of those kinds of things. You just look at things and you do them. You touch them, you reach out, you interact with the world around you, and it's very much about exploring how things feel, how they look, and not about saying, why am I doing this? Should I be doing this? From ages 2 to 7, is what we call pre-operational. So pre-operational stage is right when we start having those internalized thinking processes. So if you think about it, this is when you can start to have discussions with your niece or nephew or daughter or son about kind of morality, right? You stole so-and-so's toy, right? That's the range, the age range, when you start saying, you can't just take their toy. Or if you broke all of their crayons, now you have to give them your crayons, right? So that's where you start seeing this whole thing of internalized thought processes. So you can logic, in a very basic way, you can logic with children, right? For the most part, though, it's intuitive. So you can't be too abstract. You have to say, okay, you broke their crayons, so now you have to give them your crayons. You can't say, you broke their crayons, so now you have to do the dishes for a week so that you can earn the money to pay for new crayons for them, right? The logic has to be very parallel. So it can't be kind of complicated logic. It has to be very intuitive logic. So children become aware of their actions and the repercussions of their actions. So they learn, if you bite Mikey, then you are going to be in trouble, right? You are going to have to sit in the corner and have people count or something. I don't get the sitting in the corner and having people count thing. But anyways, my daughter-in-law does that with my grandchildren, and I'm always like, is that a punishment? Because I would be happy to go in the corner and somebody can count and I'll just have a timeout, you know. But clearly I have a different sense of kind of what would be a good thing to do in the middle of my day than my grandsons do. So certainly the one of them, he does not like sitting in the corner and counting. So I'm like, okay, how about you go do the dishes? I'll sit in the corner and count. But anyways, it doesn't work that way. She won't let me do that. So from 7 to 11, right, this is what we call the concrete operations. So this is pre, right? So this pre is before operational. Now we have concrete operational. So we still see a lot of logic, right? But you kind of get the early stages. So you can solve problems at this point. So this is where if you do break the crayons, you can say, okay, so you broke all of their crayons, so you do need to go and you have to earn the money, and then we are going to go to the store and you are going to buy new crayons for them and you're going to give them the new crayons. All right. So there's enough logic that you can draw lines between things for them, right? And you can help them identify an appropriate way to solve the problem. When you get into the age 11 and on. We call it formal operational. And that's when you can have these kinds of abstract ideas where you're not necessarily making things equivalent to one another. So you can talk about abstract ideas about like things like you hurt so-and-so's feelings, and so now you need to make it up to them, and how would you go about doing that? And they can come up with appropriate ways to make it up to them, right? Whereas earlier, if you hurt somebody's feelings, it's a very linear process. I hurt your feelings, now I need to go and make you feel better. So I'm gonna go and give you a hug, right? It's a very linear process. Instead, it's like, okay, I hurt your feelings. How did I hurt your feelings? What was I doing when I hurt your feelings? How can I make up for that particular action? You see, everything becomes that more abstract in terms of understanding things that you cannot see. Okay, so that's the key thing here. If I can get the thing to come on, there we go. So here, for the most part, it's very much about things that you can see and things that that are related in a very kind of one-to-one way, apples to apples, as we would say. Whereas when you get into here, there's a lot of things that you can't necessarily see, right? How is it that, right, what goes on below the Earth's crust? What is it that, how does wind happen? Why did the seasons change, right? That's why as you move from here to here is where you get the questions about how babies are made, for example, right? Because you start being able to say, wait a second, okay, but something is happening that I'm not seeing anywhere in society, right? And so you start understanding there's something that's going on between here and here, between the things that we can see and touch and the things that we know are happening, but are happening for a reason that we can't actually perceive. All right, so concrete operational, let me see if I can get this to go back. It doesn't want to. Okay, so concrete operational is this 7 to 11 phase. Neil, your remote is not completely cooperating. Okay, here we go. So concrete operational is this 7 to 11 phase. So this is where we start seeing this kind of logical thinking processes. This is one of the most fun ages to design for, right? It's right in between, from like 5, so from the later stages of pre-operational, from like 5 to 10, because their brains are learning, they're transitioning from this kind of intuitive understanding of the world around them to this logical understanding of the world around them, and there are a lot of opportunities for us to do things we are not doing right now. So if you think about it, let's go back to our play structure. So the play structure is right here. Play structures serve this range and not really much of anything after that except for the energy component, right? So they help little tiny babies learn how their bodies work and learn how to work with their fingers and their feet and how they move and what happens when they fall, right? So play structures are good for this age range. For the rest of the age ranges, they're only really good for burning off energy. They don't help us understand intuition, understand the repercussions of our actions. They don't necessarily do any of those things for us. So that's where we get into as we're transitioning from pre-operational to concrete operational. And that's where there's these kind of really fascinating opportunities in terms of design. So I'm going to talk about natural learning and natural learning environments because that's kind of the newest threshold in terms of design, but this has to do with this idea of helping children develop their minds through play. Okay, so the idea of cognitive development through play. All right, so in that phase, that middle phase there, concrete operational, there are 4 ideas that children develop awareness of. 4 tools that we can use. Oh, I was going to grab my mints. Oh, well. 4 tools that we can use in designing play to help children develop in terms of their cognitive understanding of the world. So conservation. All right, so this is what we're playing with here. So we're playing, I have to teach it to you guys in an abstract way. So we are in our formal operational stage of understanding of the world around us, right? But So if you have a set of items that the children are playing with, whatever those happen to be. So you have a set of items for the kids. So picture anybody from the age of 5 to 10, give or take, in that range. So you have a set of things for them to play with. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are orange, some of them are blue, some of them are round, some of them are triangles. Okay? So in concrete operational, there we go. In concrete operational, you can say, all right, we're going to organize them by shape. So we're going to say, okay, let's put all the circles together and let's put all the triangles together, all right? So this is in the category of conservation, all right? So here, right, conservation, relational, classification, number, those are the 4 concepts. So the idea of conservation is the idea that you can separate things into categories by their characteristics. So in this case, by shape, or by color, okay? So you say, okay, here's all the Legos. Let's sort them out. Put all the red ones over here, all the blue ones over here. Or let's put all the roof pieces over here and all the connector pieces over here. Okay? You can organize them by size. Let's put all the big pieces over here, all the small pieces over here. All right. Then, so that's conservation. So you still have all of the elements. That's how I think of it, is you're conserving all of the elements. It's just you're dividing them into categories. And you're only dividing them into 2 categories for conservation. Okay? Big, small, round, square, orange, blue. So with relational, so in terms of play, with relational you say, okay, let's organize them from biggest to smallest. So instead of saying orange ones are over here and blue ones are over here, and so then you put all the orange ones over here and all the blue ones over here, instead you have to say which one is bigger and which one's smaller. This one's smaller, this one's bigger. Okay, these 2. Which one's bigger, which one's smaller? This one's bigger, this one's smaller. Now, compare this one to this one, which one is bigger and which one's smaller? And this one to this one, which one's bigger and which one's smaller? Right? And then you take the next 2, which is bigger, which is smaller. Do you see? So you're looking at the relationships between each pair and then how each pair relates to the others. Classification. So, okay, so we had conservation, which is 1 or 1, right? Relational is about saying how do these relate, and then how do these relate, and how do these relate, and it's usually pair, 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 pair. Okay? This classification is a matrix. So instead of saying I have 2 categories that I'm looking at things in, or I'm comparing 2 things at a time, instead you say I have characteristics that mean that things are going in multiple boxes. So I'm looking for things that are orange and triangles, or blue and round. Right? So this is starting to recognize that the world is not just binary. The world isn't black or white. The world has these different categories. And so you can end up with things that maybe fit into even multiple boxes. Right? So for the kids, they start to understand how the world works in a different way. So in terms of play areas, so let's go back to play again. So this is very dense theory, but in terms of play areas, I hope what you can see is these kinds of ideas, right? Conservation, relational, classification, are not things that can be taught using play structures, right? These are ideas and ways of understanding the world and exploring the world around us that mean you have to actively engage with things and you have to be able to move them around. Because for kids, you can't just do this on paper. If you're doing it on paper, you're in a classroom. You need to be doing it outside. There needs to be elements for them to move around, and play structures do not do that. So that's part of the problem with the concrete operational and the pre-operational. and the formal operational phases with play structures is play structures do not have the tools, they don't have the parts for kids to be able to do these things. Okay? All right, and then number is about conservation of number. So it's about the fact that you can have 10 of things, and depending on how you space them, it looks like more or less, but it's still 10. So it's about learning that your intuition is not always correct, right? That this image, there we go, that this image has the exact same number of dots as this image. That's what it's about. It's about kids learning, I need to actually count to check. I can't always trust my intuition to know exactly what I'm looking at. That is an important skill for kids to learn, right? And it's not something they're going to learn from a play structure. Okay. And number is also about the fact that this has the same area as this plus this, and it also has the same area as this plus this plus this plus this. All right, so this particular component, let me give you an example of what this can look like in play areas. So things like this you can play with in terms of design, in terms of mass and volume. So if you have, for example, if you have a series of small spheres that are relatively heavy and a series of large spheres that are relatively light, but they look exactly the same other than the fact that they're heavy and light. And then if you have some kind of what we would call a teeter-totter, if you have some kind of balancing device where the kids can put the heavy things on one side and they can put the light things on the other, and they can see how many of the big things it takes to make the teeter-totter move as compared to a small number of the small things, right? Then they start learning that things are not exactly as they seem, and that there is this idea of conservation of mass. That just because you've got 4 of one thing and 4 of another doesn't mean that they weigh the same thing. And just because things are big doesn't mean that they're heavy, right? And it's the same thing. So you can have sticks that are different lengths and lines on the ground where they can put the sticks out and they can see how many sticks does it take to make that line, how many sticks does it take to make this line if my sticks are different lengths, right? So what these things are, these spheres and sticks and things that can be moved, we call these loose parts. So when we talk about children's play, we talk about loose parts. And that is what play structures lack. That is why sandboxes are still popular, even in this day and age, because it is basically a whole series of loose parts. You give a child a sandbox and a bucket and a spoon, and they can do all kinds of things with that, right? Because they're loose parts. They aren't assigned in terms of their function. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay. I think this is our last theory. Play area archetypes. For some reason, the students always really like this one. I think because it's very related to what you can see in the real world. So play area archetypes, we talk about 3 play area archetypes. So here's the deal. When you are designing a children's play area, regardless of whether it's an indoor or an outdoor play area, a children's play area needs to have 3 types of spaces, which is what these are. You need to have a large open space for sports. So you need to have some kind of open space where they can play soccer or baseball or run around with some kind of ball or badminton or whatever, right? So you need to have a large open space for large groups of people to play sports with rules where somebody wins and somebody loses and where there are conflicts that have to be negotiated. So you can see how that ties back to the different things that I pointed out, right? The stages of play, the different things that children need to learn, the fact that they need to learn to get hurt, and they need to learn how to manage conflict. So you need to have these large spaces. So those are what we call campfires. So these large open spaces that are specifically for sports. Watering holes are smaller spaces. So these are spaces that are for smaller groups. They're not for sports. They're for small group activities. They're for children to kind of just play as a group of 5 or a group of 10, where this is where you might play hopscotch, right? Or you might just throw a ball back and forth. You may just throw a football back and forth. Or you might make crafts, you might make mud pies. That's what I used to do when I was a child. I made endless numbers of mud pies. That was my thing. I do not know why. But anyways, mud pies, and I would make them, and then I would decorate the top of them with little pebbles and all kinds of stuff. And then I would take them and show them to my mom. And then I do not remember what happened to the mud pies. I have a sneaky suspicion my mother did something with them. But anyways, okay, so watering holes are these smaller scale spaces for small groups. Okay, and then caves or niches. So that's how you pronounce that, niche. N-I-C-H-E-S, niches. So caves or niches. Niches are small spaces. So if I look in this room, there's a niche right here. There's a niche in the corner. There's a niche under the desk. There's a niche in that corner. So it's all these kind of small little spaces that are tucked away where somebody can hide. All right? So niches are also very, very important for children's play. For one thing, you want to have enough room in a niche for 1 or 2 kids. And it doesn't have to be a lot of room. It can be pretty squishy. So the idea behind niches is that you should feel like you're part of what's going on around you, but still feel separate. You should be able to feel like you can watch and you're safe. You can hide away. So spaces like, here, let's go back. So spaces like this space underneath the play structure, this becomes a cave or a niche. Here, where they've laid branches up against this tree, creates a cave or a niche here underneath it. Okay? So, 3 types of spaces. Large open spaces for active play, for exercise. Middle-scaled spaces for small group play. And then caves or niches for 1 or 2 children to interact and have quiet, usually quiet play. Okay? So, the big spaces are about the sensory motor skills and practicing your sensory motor skills. They're about your social skill development. They're about conflict management, getting hurt, finding your way through things, negotiating, learning those types of interpersonal skills, right? And then the middle-sized spaces are about creative play. They're about trying things on, becoming someone else, acting, theatrical efforts. They're about all of those creative things that happen. And then caves and niches are about getting away and having a safe place for just you and someone else to talk or to read or to have quiet time. All right, so if we talk about those spaces, we have the large-scale spaces, right? We have the campfires, we have the watering holes, and we have the niches or the caves. Campfire, watering hole, niche, right? Exercise, large-scale exercise spaces, middle-scale spaces, small-scale spaces. Then those match up with the size of groups that children need to learn to play in. So children need to learn how to negotiate their way through a large group activity. They need to learn how to work with a large group of people. They need to learn how to work with a small group. They need to learn how to work in pairs, negotiate one-on-one with one person, and they need to learn how to play happily as an individual. So each of these types, so what we know from cognitive development and social skills development in children is if children have experience in all of these realms, in all of these sizes of groups, they develop better as individuals. They function better in school. They function better in life eventually. And this is why you see children's play groups, right? You see library play dates. You have swimming lessons. These are all efforts that parents make who have 1 children or 2 children at home, in which case their children are learning how to function as pairs and individually. These are efforts that parents make to create situations for their children to learn how to function in large groups and small groups, which is why they play t-ball or they play soccer. Even tiny, tiny little children. It's not about teaching them how to play soccer, right? It's about teaching them how to play with kids, how to play with people, how to learn the rules, how to follow the rules, what happens when you don't follow the rules. Okay, so large groups. So those large groups where we're talking about our campfires, our large spaces, they're about learning teamwork, negotiating group dynamics, and cooperation. Somebody needs to wake him up. You needed to go get coffee, dude. Seriously. All right. Small groups and pairs. So when you're dealing with a group of 5 or 6, you're learning your communication skills. You learn how to share. Oh my goodness, sharing, the lost skill. You learn how to help one another. You learn how to say, here, I'll help you do that. You can help me do this. Or sometimes you learn how to say, I'll help you do that, and it's fine, right? And here's where what we call practicing social expectations. Taking turns. I'll go first, then you get to go. This is my turn. No, it really is my turn. You know, as you know with children, it's like, it's my turn. Wait, it was just your turn. It's my turn. No. It's not always your turn. Greeting. So these kind of social expectations of saying hi and saying thank you and saying goodbye, and providing assistance. Oh, you're having problems with that. I can help. It's not just about me and what I need. So small groups are very important. You can see how these are the kind of social skills that grease the wheels of us as a society. And then individual play helps children develop their self-image, and their self-value. They have a sense of who I am and what I like and what my priorities are. You can see how if you have a child that whenever they're alone is on the computer or on a video game, they're not going to develop these things, right? So it's not just about saying, okay, so my child needs to have their group time so they can develop their group skills, and at home they can watch TV or play on their, what are those things? Their Game Boys or whatever, their Xboxes. If your child is not actually playing separate from digital stuff, if they're not actually doing things that mean that they're physically interacting with the world around them, they are not learning these skills. You do not learn comfort with yourself by watching TV. All right, affordances. So when I was talking about like the spheres, the balls, I should put this over here because otherwise it won't be in the video. When I was talking about the spheres and the balls and the sticks and the logs and rocks and branches and all of those kinds of things, those are things that have affordances. This is the term that we use. It's a very awkward term, but it is very important. So, a space that has affordances is a space that has opportunities for you to do things that you recognize. So, a space where a play structure, let's go back to play structures. So a play structure has a limited number of affordances. It tells you how to play with it. For the most part, when you see a slide, you think, oh, that's something you're supposed to slide down. When you see a swing, you say that is something you're supposed to swing on, right? Those are spaces and play tools that do not have very many affordances. They do not suggest, I can do all of these things with this. Instead, they have built-in rules. I'm supposed to do this with this thing, and this with this thing, and this with this thing. So affordances are the capacity of the spaces around us to be customized to what we want. And they are also the ability for those spaces to suggest and openness to being changed. Okay? So a space with affordances is a space that says we can move this around. And it also says, and we don't need to use it in this particular way. So let's look at this room. So this room, in my opinion, is lacking in affordances to a fairly significant extent. So if we look around, it's like, okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 of these pod things, right? So it is difficult to look at these pod things and say, okay, can we come up with a different way of setting up these pods so that we could do something really interesting in class that is not either me talking or you guys working in a group of 6, right? If I said, okay, I want you guys to work in a group of 10, right? It's like, okay, how would we do that, right? These tables are really not designed for more than, it's like they're not really designed for less than 4, and they're not really designed for more than 6, right? So, and they're not designed for, like, for example, they're not designed to be turned the other way against the wall with the round end against the wall. They're designed so the round end kind of has to be in towards the middle of the room. They're not designed so that we can really turn them sideways and work with them that way. We can't even stack them in a big row and create one big table in the middle of the room because it would look like a flower or something, right? So, so for me, I walked in this room and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. It's kind of fun. It's set up for groups. I like the tables. I hate those, the tablet chairs. I hate those things. But it's like, this is really set up so that it's really hard to do stuff with this space, right? Even just the fact that everything has to be plugged in, so everything has to be associated with a plug, right? So for me, if I was designing this room so that multiple people could look at it and see what they wanted to see in it, and see an opportunity for them to do what they wanted to do in this space, I would probably have chairs like this. These are great chairs. I don't know if they've stacked, I haven't tried, but these are pretty darn good chairs, right? But these tables suck. So I would design tables that were about 2 feet wide and maybe 5 feet long, so they were skinny and long. And then I would design them so that I could then create one table that was 2 by 5 for 2 people, or I could do them face to face, and then I would have 4 by 5, or I could create a whole long line of them. So I had something that was 5 feet wide and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 feet long. Or I could do them end to end, so it was 10 feet wide and 2, 4, 6, 8, right? And those tables, I would make sure those tables were light and easily movable so that I could put them against the wall, so we could have something against the wall, or we could create a big U shape in the middle of the room, or we could create a circle in the middle of the room, or we could create pods with them if we wanted them, right? So we could create this setup with tables like that, right? But we could also do all of those other things. That is affordances. It's not just the ability to do things differently. It's also that the things that you use suggest that flexibility. So, for example, in terms of children's play, one of the things that has a great deal of affordances is Lego, right? So Lego you look at it and you're like, I could build big things, I can build small things, I can build buildings, I can build bridges, or like my nephew, he builds like spaceships and boats, and he's like an artist with Lego, So those are things that have affordances. So play structures do not have affordances. They do not suggest an openness and an ability to be customized to what somebody wants. So, so the example that I use is a project a student of mine a long time ago did, where he went out and he met with a bunch of 8-year-olds. So he had like a focus group. I think it was maybe 12 8-year-olds. And he went out to these 12 8-year-olds on the East Coast, and he asked them to describe their perfect play area. And so they had this whole discussion about what their perfect play area would look like. And children, like adults, always start with what they're familiar with. This is what we were talking about, right? So they started with, oh, it would have swings. Oh, it would have a teeter-totter. Oh, it would have this or that, right? They started with all of these pieces of things that they've experienced elsewhere. And then someone said, well, my favorite play area is that old couch in the woods. And all of them were like, oh yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, I would rather have the couch in the woods than the swings. I would rather have the couch in the woods than anything else. And in the end, their ideal play area really was this couch in the woods. And what this old couch that these kids had, so they had this old couch in the woods. So you think about an old couch in the woods. So it's a couch, it's got trees all around it, right? So first, they could climb the trees and jump out of the trees onto the couch, right? This is the whole climbing up on the railing and jumping thing. So the couch provides them with that, right? Then they can turn the couch upside down and turn it into a tunnel, right? Or they can turn the couch sideways and turn it into a fort. Or they can all hang out and sit on the couch because it's a comfy place to sit and chat and talk about stuff, right? So for these kids, this couch, in combination with that setting, those trees and the privacy, this couch had massive affordances associated with it. It had opportunities for them to turn it into what they wanted it to be. Okay? So the idea of affordances, so for example, right, the always popular fort, right, the couch fort. This, my nephew and my niece, when they were little kids, this was their favorite thing to do with Auntie Leanne when I came to visit, right, is we would take the fort, we would take the couch, the back of the couch, and we would take all the dining room chairs, and we would move them all around, and then we would get the blankets, and we would build a fort, and then we would go inside the fort, and we would read books. And so that idea, the idea of the couch and the blankets and the fort and those things, that is affordances. When we talk about affordances, so instead of having things that kids look at and say, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do with this, it's like, okay, here's a blanket, here's a couch, what can we do, right? Those are affordances. All right, so thinking about that, bringing that kind of thinking, the thinking of the fort in the living room into a children's play area and saying, what does that look like? How do we design for that? So let's see what my slide says, because I just totally ignored it. So a wide range of transactions between the landscape and the environment. Fancy way of saying lots of things that you can do with this small number of tools, right? Choice, variety, and opportunity. So big things and small things, heavy things and light things, right? Because it is really hard to make that couch fort without the things that are on the outside corners. And the things on the outside corners, you guys know, those things got to be heavy, right? Otherwise, the blankets just kind of collapse on you. So, and children will alter their environment to make the affordances better suit them. So children have a capacity to do this, right? We as adults we have a bad tendency to look at a room like this and we come in and we're like, okay, that's how the room is, right? I walked in this room first class and I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's really weird. I didn't even know this was here. And I was like, okay, how can I use this? And it was like, I'm not sure, right? It's hard to figure out how to alter this type of environment to suit what I would like to do in terms of my learning goals for you guys, right? It's way easier for kids. They're way better at it. All right, so one of the things that we're going to talk about in this class more as we go now is environmental attitudes and stewardship and conservation. So how do we, in this case, because we're talking about children, how do we raise children so that they are environmentally positive in their attitudes, what we would call sustainable, okay? So how do we raise them so they're environmentally friendly? So in terms of this, part of the thinking around this is that children need to be outside. They need to have these kind of environmental experiences. I'll give you an example. Kids that go to U-Pick farms are far more likely to be conservation minded than children who don't do that. So adults who had that childhood experience going to a U-Pick farm and picking strawberries or apples or whatever at the U-Pick farm, that experience is absolutely definitive in terms of people as an adult and their attitude towards the environment, right? So those are the types of things. When we talk about environmental experiences for childhood development, everybody on their list for their kids and what their kids, experiences their kids are supposed to have before they grow up should have go to a U-Pick farm and pick strawberries, right? If not, just because the strawberries are awesome, right? All right, I remember I did that. I did U-Pick strawberries with my mom and my brother. And I remember just like eating so many strawberries. I was just like bloated for days. But I also remember being out in nature and picking blueberries, right? Real blueberries in nature, in the bush, you know. And we also grew raspberries in our backyard. And so I remember going out and picking raspberries from the backyard. And those are very definitive experiences in my memory. And I am absolutely positive that those were kind of fundamental in terms of building my way of looking at the world. My understanding of the world as providing food in an immediate way for me, right? The world cares for me. All right, so let's talk about how we do it beyond providing U-Pick. So there's 3 types of environmental experiences that kids can have. So the first is this kind of direct experience. So what we call a direct environmental experience is an environmental experience with like natural nature, wild and crazy nature. So when I was out in the bush picking my blueberries, that was a direct experience with nature. There was nothing that intervened between me and nature, right? There was no person who was out there planting the blueberries so that I would see them or maintaining the area around the blueberry bush so that I wouldn't get scratched, right? That was me and nature and eating blueberries on the spot, right? Same thing, I remember creating a fort in the woods up near the Great Lakes. And it was just a patch of open space in the woods. And I remember collecting all of these pieces of wood, and I remember building this fort in this little open space in the woods. There was nothing, no adult had cut a trail, had cut the wood for me, had done anything. It was me and nature. And that's that kind of direct experience of nature, right? It's not manicured, it's not based in a park. Indirect experience of nature has this kind of maintained character to it. So if you go, for example, you go for a hike. You go up to Mount Baldy with your niece and your nephew and you take them on a hike. That is an indirect experience of nature because for the most part those trails are maintained and you are taking those children out on the hike. So you are providing that kind of guidance and control for that experience. Whereas when I went out and I made that fort, there were no adults around. I did that completely on my own, right? So that direct, that's me on my own doing my thing as a child. Indirect has an adult almost always involved. And then symbolic, that's where our experience of nature becomes one step removed. So this is where we draw pictures of the experience that we had. We go out into nature and then we paint a picture or we draw a picture or we make our mud pie, right? My whole thing was mud pies. So we make a mud pie, which is neither mud nor a pie. It is a symbolic thing that links the two things together. So it's not in real life, right? It has to do with stepping away from things. So you can also see here, none of these types of environmental experiences actually work through a television screen with the possible exception of this bottom one, right? But certainly these top two, you can't use a computer for those. You have to actually physically be in the environment. Okay. All right, so there's their experiences. Now, this is where we get into our you pick. How do we encourage children to be environmentally sensitive? Right? I will tell you, this is one of those weird things. When I did my PhD research, one of the things that they asked me to identify was the major influences on these adults that had these large pieces of property that we wanted to preserve from suburban sprawl. And so they said, okay, find out who are the major influences on these people. So we had this whole list of people who influenced them, right? Educators, people on TV, people who wrote articles in magazines. Like, who did they listen to? Whose opinions did they say mattered? And number 2 on the bloody list was their children. Number 2, right? So these parents, the second biggest source of information for them in terms of the environment was their kids. Because their kids, for the most part, were more current than they were. And so if you can get the kids to go home and say, Dad, why aren't we recycling? We should be recycling. And I can tell you, if you have a small child who comes home and they have a bug in their ear about something like recycling, and they're like, Dad, we should be recycling. That's recyclable. How come you threw the newspaper in the garbage? The newspaper should be going in the recycling. Dad, you're supposed to put aluminum in. Didn't you know aluminum is the number 1 thing we should be recycling, right? And that child would go and go and go and go with that poor parent about recycling until that parent would finally give in, right? You guys, every single one of you has had a child experience like that where you're like, fine, oh my God, right? So that is why this is so important. Because frankly, if we are going to fix the mess that we are in environmentally right now, how are we going to change to the attitudes of these adults about climate change? I can tell you, convince the kids. We just got to convince the kids, and then they will nag the living crap out of their parents. They'll be like, don't you love me? If you loved me, you would take the bus because you're polluting the planet, and I'm going to have to fix it after you die. And the guilt factor of that is going to take every parent down. Seriously. Those kids are going to win. Look at his face. He's like totally like, yeah, my kids come home and there's, I'm a goner. I'm taking the bus. All right. So how do we get these kids to buy into this? Okay? How do we convert those tiny little Nazis into taking the position we want them to take? All right. Between ages 5 and 10, kids relate to the environment emotionally. Okay? So, let's see. So, A is emotion. It's affect. B is behavior. And C is cognitive. Okay? So from 5 to 10, the majority of their relationship with the environment is based on their emotions. Which is why you would have a child between the ages of 5 and 10 come home and say, if you loved me, you would recycle because I'm the one who's going to have to clean up the planet after you die, Dad, right? It's emotional. It's an emotional connection, right? This, the sun loves me, I love the planet, right? It's all about emotion. When you hit ages 10 to 12, during this kind of little middle zone, the connection is very much cognitive. All right, so it's C. So the dominant factor in those relationships is cognitive. So between ages 10 and 12, you have to be able to relate to them factually in terms of the environment. So this is the age range where you have to be able to answer their questions, right? what is the difference between greenhouse gas and climate change? Is greenhouse gas a contributor to climate change? Are they the same thing, right? So the factual knowledge about those systems has a great deal of power for children at this age. So if you spend all of your time with children between the ages of 10 and 12 talking basketball, then what they're going to learn is basketball, right? If you spend your time talking about environmental things, that's what they're going to learn. This is a very powerful age for factual knowledge about things. So whatever it is you spend your time talking about, if you are talking about makeup and false eyelashes and balayage, that is what they're going to learn about between the ages of 10 and 12. Okay. From 12 to 16, that's when you start seeing more of a balance in terms of their interactions with the environment. So you see this kind of moral trait that says, I have a responsibility, right? So this is emotional, right? I love the planet. I want to care for the planet, right? The planet is my mother, this kind of thing. This is, the planet has all of these things I need to understand about it. And then this is, I have a responsibility to behave in a particular way. Okay. So if you're trying to design children's play, design interactions for children, outdoor ones particularly, then you want to create opportunities for them to relate to the environment emotionally, factually, and morally and ethically. So you can see how each of these components kind of ties in as you're trying to come up with a way to design. So for example, signs and ways of collecting information about the environment are very powerful from 10 to 12. So if you, for example, if you want to teach kids about water quality, ages 10 to 12, if you have water quality monitors and they get to collect the data and put it online and they get to track how the water quality changes after a storm, you know, when there's a big flush of pollutants that go into the river, that's extremely powerful during this age range. It's also when you want to go out and like look for birds and then you look up the birds online. What bird is this? What's the habitat? Yes.
What was B considered?
That's behavior. Yeah. For some reason I'm missing that slide. All right, so let's talk about design. So I've given you guys, how many? 9 or something?
10 theories?
Is it 10? 10. I've given you 10 theories. Okay, so I talked about this at the beginning of class. Children originally being seen as small adults, and this shift to thinking of children as these kind of different people. Part of it was also that we had this initial movement where people moved from the country to the city. As cities grew, they moved off the farms and into the city. And then what happened in this same period of time, during that exact same window when we started saying, okay, children are different species, they're not just small adults, the same period of time we also said, cities are not healthy. And so we are going to move away from the city. And that same period, the early 1900s, is when we saw the growth of the suburb, right? So during that same period of time, we started saying, okay, see, we've got all these people living in the city, and that's where the tanneries are. That's where the slaughterhouses, the abattoirs. Abattoir is a slaughterhouse. A tannery is where you make leather goods, right? So that's where all of these pollutants and all this bad air quality and all of these things were in the city. And people said, okay, we need to get away from all of these bad characteristics, so we're going to move to the outskirts of the city. And at the same time, in the United States, at the same time as that was happening, right? Children are a specific breed. Cities are dirty. We want to move outside the city. And at the same time, we had the car become popular. So that is how we got suburbs. That intersection of things happening all at the same time is how we got suburbs where people commute to work. All right, so the absence of nature in the city, because we had these cities and they were polluted and they were nasty and they were densely populated, And so we didn't have nature in the city, and we thought that that led to physical problems. It made people sick. We didn't really understand the science of it at that point, but they were right. It did make people sick, and it made people immoral. That was the whole thing of going to the park would make you healthier, and it would make you less likely to be a criminal. It makes you a better person. So this whole idea of open space became tied to this idea of kind of, Protestant work ethic, Christianity, good people, connection to God, all of these kinds of things. Regardless of your religious position, this kind of connection to environment and higher being became very popular during that period. So what we saw was the creation of play spaces that looked like this, right? So this is what I was talking about. Things were very rectilinear. They were very much about programming. So that was like, this is for a sport, and this is how we will design the space. And it would have lines on it. Initially, they were what we would today call DG surfaces. And then eventually we paved them. And so it was this thinking around, we need to keep people busy. We need to keep them out of trouble. And being in the city makes you sick. That led to these parks that were actually, for the most part, paved, right? They were highly programmed. They weren't open spaces. Those were a very different thing, right? The whole idea of trails we don't see until 1957. The idea of trails and parks, 1957. So for you guys, this whole idea of trails and going out for a hike is very much part of your culture, but it's only 70 years old. Before that, there were no trails. There were sidewalks that got you from A to B, but that was it, right? So this idea of going out in nature and walking because it was healthy and it made you feel good was not anywhere in the public consciousness. So this is what we saw in the early 1900s. Then as we hit, the 1980s or so, this is what we saw. This surplus energy theory, right? So this design is very much about saying people need to burn off their energy. Otherwise, they're going to get themselves into trouble. And it was very much, in terms of those development stages, sensory motor. It was very much about saying, teaching people how to use their bodies and run and kind of large motor skills, right? Use your muscles, use your arms, use your legs. This is the new version of that, right? And it's basically exactly the same. It looks a lot nicer, but it's basically the same thing. So we have a large flat area that has places for people to walk and run and play basketball, and has a few trees, but not very many, and here's your basketball court, right? Has this small area for shade. But other than that, this is completely paved. This is not a space that's designed for reflection or creativity or one-on-one interaction. This is designed for exercise and motor skill development. So we still buy into this way of thinking. All right. So here we go. 1900s, that's when we saw the play structures, which I showed you guys. Then in the 1970s. So 1970s, we had a major step. We still have not come all the way, right? We're still doing play structures. But in the 1970s, we started saying, wait, just providing a place to play like this is not good enough. It's more than just providing a place to play. It's that it should be nature. And so we started saying, so even here we have some trees, but not very many. In fact, this looks like artificial turf to me. I think it is artificial turf. It's actually an award-winning project, which is scary. But anyways, we started saying kids need nature. They don't just need play areas. They don't just need sports. They need nature. And so this was part of the 70s. You can see how that would come from the 70s, right? Flower children and, and pot and tie-dye and nature, right? So it's like what I call tree-hugging, granola-eating, Birkenstock wearing, right? So all of which I do, by the way. But anyways, so the 1970s, we started saying, okay, children need nature, not just play. And so we have what we call natural learning environments, NLEs. Natural learning environments are spaces where we have trees and dirt and wood chip mulch and things that are natural materials for children to play with. And with natural learning environments, we start to see those things that I was talking about earlier, loose parts and affordances. Because natural learning environments, by definition, did not have play areas that were defined for very specific uses. They were much more open in terms of how they could be used. So logs like this could be moved and rolled and stacked, and wood chips could be moved and used to build things, and rocks could be used to build things, right? So loose parts and affordances. Having an environment, this is a play environment just as much as that play structure was, but there is a capacity for the children to customize it for themselves. All right, so let's talk about the why here. So why do we do this? Why do we create outdoor children's play environments? First, because we want children to use their bodies. We want them to learn how to use all of their senses. The whole idea of senses, we're not going to talk about in this class. There's a whole body of theory around eidetics, which is the word that we use for using all of your senses beyond just your sense of sight. And you can imagine in our society we have a major problem with sight dominating our sensory experience of the world. We no longer use our noses and our sense of touch and our sense of hearing as much as we do our sense of sight. Right? Our sense of sight completely overwhelms everything. But think about this for a second. Think about your childhood and think about that nasty bubble gum that was like purple. It was supposed to be grape flavored, right? It was like where I grew up, it was called Bubblicious, right? And it was like this huge wad of purple. I thought it was delicious at the time. Think about how that tasted, right? Think about that smell, that weird pseudo grape smell of that gum, right? That idea of sensory, especially smell, the smell of that Bubblicious, that is a far more significant retriever of memory than sight. So just seeing a pack of Bubblicious will not take you back to your childhood as much as smelling Bubblicious would, right? So it's very important. This whole idea of senses and getting children to use their senses is really, really important, right? It's also important at the other end when we're dealing with seniors, right? We should probably assign every person with dementia a pack of Bubblicious, and have them chew once a week because it will probably really help, right? Like I think about things like, there's a very interesting article on it, but I think about things like the smell of Pez, right? Pez dispensers, remember the smell of Pez, right? The smell of like your gym clothes when you forgot them in the bottom of your gym bag and it was like, slightly ripe, right? Those scents, very, very, there's a part of your brain that they trigger your amygdala, which nothing else does such a good job of triggering, right? Okay, so senses, right? So we're also talking about muscle mass. So muscle mass, when we talk about muscle mass, those are the big muscles. Being able to climb things and lift yourself and move yourself. Coordination, so you don't get hurt, right? Healthy organs, right? Running around so that your heart is strong. Outdoor learning, cognitive understanding. This is the stuff I was talking about earlier when I was talking about relational, classification, the whole idea of the numbers and the spheres and the triangles. This stuff. Mass, volume, weight, distance, and height. If you are just learning these things in the classroom, you're learning them as abstract ideas. When you are outside, you can learn these things as real entities. You can have things that are big and things that are small that weigh different things. You can have things that put together, combine to be equivalent to something else. You can teach people the distance, how this is X distance inside and outside that actually feels much smaller, right? And height. People can climb on things outside where we won't let them climb on things inside. Outdoor experiences encourage reflection. I don't know why, but they do. Right? When we go outside, we think back. We remember things that we don't do when we're inside. Discovery and spontaneity happens outside. So people are more creative outside than they are inside. And then this idea of pain and injury, which I've talked about. The fact that children need to learn what the limits of their bodies are, and they need to learn that they can hurt and survive. All right. So this is that space in Chicago that I was talking about with the hills, right? And it was really interesting to watch because it was mostly just like one child playing kind of on their own or like in pairs, but for the most part it was just these individual children running up and running down and running up and running down and running up and running down. And so it was clearly about more than just sensory motor, right? There was clearly something about seeing the world in a different way or experiencing the three-dimensionality of the world in a different way. It was a really neat place. I had to be very careful for people to not think I was like stalking their children, which is always a problem when you're trying to take pictures of children's play areas. When I was first in practice, when I was like, only a little bit older than you guys, that was my job, was to inspect children's play areas for making sure that they were safe. And so I would go to these children's play areas and I would have to climb around underneath and inspect all of the rivets and all the welding and everything to make sure nothing was rusting and stuff like that. And it was like, oh my goodness, it is so hard not to look like a pervert when you do this, right? Anyways, okay, so when I talk about natural play areas, all right, so that first rationale for outdoor play, absolutely, play structures, get kids to use their senses, to use their muscles. Natural play areas are important for different reasons, right? Aggression incidents decrease, and imagination and creative social interactions increase. This is pretty big deal in this day and age. It's like, okay, how do we teach kids not to be aggressive? Well, if we give them natural play areas, that helps. There's something about natural play areas that teach them not to be aggressive and to be more imaginative and creative. Using their hands increases a child's ability to learn. I'm sure for all of you guys, if I had time in this class and I could take you all out to a play structure and have you play with loose parts, that would help reinforce this learning so much better than just me talking about it, right? So using your hands. Dramatic play, whoops, can't get the thing to go when I want it to, now I can't get it to stop. Dramatic play occurs near bushes. Oh, there we go. So if you want to create opportunities for that kind of individual play where kids pretend to be someone else, right? I'm a fireman, I'm a letter carrier, I'm a flight attendant, all of those things, the predominant number of them happen near bushes, right? And I can tell you, for the most part, there is something about that sense of safety and enclosure that you have, that some vegetation gives you. You don't want to feel closed off, but you want to feel protected so that you can then kind of leave yourself behind and take on the persona of someone else. And we know, the research shows, for kids, if you want them to be creative, if you want them to pretend to be someone else, you have to create this kind of semi-enclosed experience. So, bushes and other vegetation. And then that kind of unstructured play that we get from outdoor natural learning environments lets us do this work with pairs and small groups and large groups. It gives all of those opportunities if it's designed properly. Here in California, there are things we do extremely well here in California, and I came to California because I saw opportunities here. The thing that I see about California that probably you guys, is probably mostly California natives, don't see, the reason I came here is because there are things that I want to do that nobody has ever done before. And California is the one place in the United States where you can propose to do something that nobody has ever done before, and people go, huh, that sounds kind of cool. How do we go about doing that? Whereas my experience is everywhere else in the United States, when I propose something that nobody has ever done before, people say, who's done that before? How do we know it's going to work, right? So California, there is an openness to doing things that haven't been done before that does not necessarily exist elsewhere in the country. Here in California, we are perfectly willing to be the first people to try something. We're like, nobody's ever done that before? Yeah, okay, sure, no problem. We can try that. And that's why I came here. But that being said, California is so crappy at some things. California does a crappy job of children's play areas. You see so few examples of really well done children's play areas. So few. Like, I can't actually name you one that I have seen that I'm like, that is amazing. I can't name you not even one.
There's one done by Kat Super Whiskey. It's like where she takes sticks and branches and allows kids to like explore them at the LA Natural History Museum just outside. It's like where
sounds perfect.
Yeah.
At the Natural History Museum.
Outside in the gardens, they're by their garden space outside.
Natural History Museum. Okay, that's going on my list.
Yeah.
Cool. Good. Yay, Kat. So, all right. So we've got those three areas that we talked about before, right? So we had if you think about those pie charts where I had ABC, right? Affective, behavioral, or cognitive. Here's affective. Affective is emotional. There's the word, affective. B is your physical or behavioral. And then C is cognitive, right? Your intelligence. So this is about using your brain. This is about using your body. And this is about using your heart. All right, so all three areas need to be addressed for children. All right, let's talk about our principles. So, we are designing children's play areas. We're designing them outside of the Natural History Museum, or we're designing them at your local school, or in your local park, or at your local homeowners association. All right, so you're going to zone your play areas. So for the most part, what you don't want to do is do what I think of as kind of the furniture placement approach to design, where you say, okay, so we have all of these trees, let's scatter them across the site in this way. It's like create zones. This is your campfire. This is your, this is where I'm going to have niches. This is where children are going to play in large groups. This is where children are going to play in small groups. Here's where we're going to have creative play. You want to create zones for these things to happen. You don't just scatter them randomly across the landscape. The second thing you want to do is you want to create themes for your zones. Children, this is where it's so much fun. And sometimes I have students and they're like, oh, it's kind of like tacky, or it's like, but it's fun. It's Disneyland, for goodness sakes. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark over here, Star Wars over here. It's just you don't do it that, heavy-handed. But that's why that is so powerful for us as human beings, is it creates variety in terms of our experience. And as designers, it gives us something around which to make design decisions, right? We know that if we have Star Wars and we have Raiders of the Lost Ark, we're going to be working with different materials and different colors and different types of topography and different interfaces, right? You're not going to be driving a Jeep, right? You're not going to be going through things with vines hanging in your hair, right? You're going to be driving a storm, an AT, right? You're going to be driving something that has all this technology associated with it and has flashing lights. You're not going to be going over rocks, right? And so that theming gives us things to work with, but also then helps kids with wayfinding, right? And creates a sense of excitement. They can understand that space because there are certain rules that it follows. So you theme your zones. And then you keep in mind that you're trying to address all three of those realms. The cognitive, right? The heart, the head, the affective, the heart, and the behavior, the physical environment. So you're trying to address all three. So what you should not be doing is just providing tools for sports right? You should also be providing things for creative play to happen and things with problems for people to solve, right? So ABC, all three, affective, behavioral, and cognitive. Neil, do you have one of the bottles of water over there? No? Okay. I'm just losing my voice. Really? Okay. All right. Principle 4. This is where we come into affordances and loose parts. Okay? So you want to create opportunities for children to modify their space. So this is where, when we are talking about current play structures today, they have those play surfaces, right? The rubberized play surface under the children's play areas, which are great for safety. They're awesome for safety, and I've designed ones that were really fun. I designed one that had like sharks all swimming around on it that was all part of the patterning, and it can be a lot of fun, but they have no affordances. There's no capacity for people to look at that and think, oh, I can do something really fun with that. No, it's like, okay, I need sand, or I need wood chips, or I need something I can move around and stack and, and run through my fingers and add water to make things, right? So you want to create opportunities for them to modify their spaces. So things like rocks and sticks and wood and logs, things to climb through, things to move around, right? So I can't remember where this project was, but so things like having pieces of fabric that they can use for something, having pillows. That's that whole idea of the couch in the woods, right? It's not just about the couch, it's the fact that you have the pillows from the couch. You can take a nap, right? So bricks and the wood chips, even the garbage cans, you'll find that kids will turn them over on their side and they'll use them to jump over, and they'll use them as tunnels, they'll use them to hide in. The really great play areas end up looking like a big junkyard, unfortunately, but, and loose parts, right? So there's an upside down laundry container. There's some kind of scoop, right? Here's a bucket, a bunch of pieces of wood, right? This is a sonotube for those of you who are familiar with construction. There's a ladder. I have one where there's like a colander or something. So this is the type of environment that creates opportunities for dramatic play and creative development. There it is. So, right, creating opportunities for them to create musical instruments and discover how different things can sound. A friend of mine wants to put light bulbs inside of these so that the lights, hit the rooms, right? So discovering things like that for children, right? Looking at how the shadow is cast on there with all of the little circles is part of the experience. Right? There's your fort. So fabric and sticks and logs and rope. Oh, here we go. There's the plunger. Right? So there's that bubble wrap, which, I always like pop, pop, pop. But, right? So your plunger, here's some pipes, your bubble wrap, egg cartons, boxes. Oh, boxes are so much fun. It's no surprise that one of our big jokes that we make about children is, that they'd rather play with the box than the toy, right? Boxes have affordances. Boxes have capacity to be used for all kinds of things, especially big boxes. Neil and I have started for our grandchildren. We've started sending them things that are very non-children oriented. So we've been sending them things like the yardsticks that come out that collapse down and come out like this so that they can measure things, and they become really, really small or really, really big. It turns out they also then turn into swords and fencing things, which is what happened last time. And like flour sifters, those old-fashioned ones that have the handle that you do this and they go, and like wooden spoons and stuff. Our grandkids love those things. Their other grandparents are like, I'm going to send the child a leapfrog. You know, we're sending them some wooden spoons. So they like them. Hey, I am Grandma Pancake. And Grandma Pancake, that is like the ultimate compliment from a 2-year-old. If you are a pancake, that is just premium. Right, Neil? There's Grandpa Pancake.
Yes.
Well, it's one of those things, right? It's like, what do they like more than anything else right now? Pancakes. And so when we come to visit them, we get christened pancakes because we are the best people to play with, right? Just like the pancakes. But what we provide them with is loose parts. That's what we do. Come on, there we go. All right. This idea of immersive experiences, this is associated with that whole you pick experience too, right? It's a very immersive experience. When you go to a you pick farm, you park your car, you walk in, you're surrounded by rows of fruit or vegetables and other people picking fruit or vegetables. You're immersed in the smell. If we talk about the strawberries, you're immersed in the smell of the strawberries, and the texture of the strawberries, and the texture of the dirt underneath your fingernails, and the texture of the little leaves as you're picking, right? All of those things are part of your experience, and it's an immersive experience. This idea of immersive experiences is very, very important if you are trying to change people's attitudes, right? So if you can immerse somebody in an experience, then they will, it changes not just their heads, but also their hearts and their guts. It changes how they feel about something. So I had a group of students that went and did study abroad, and part of my students went to Prague, to Czechoslovakia. The other group of students went to Ghana, West Africa. And the Prague experience was very good for my students. But the West Africa experience, those students came back different because of their immersive experience in a society that was poor in a way that they had never experienced before. So eating the same things these people ate, sleeping the way they slept, and experiencing their lives, that kind of immersive experience changes you, right? And so if you can create immersive experiences for children where everything about what the experience is that they have is consistent with that and is transporting them into a different place, it's very, very powerful. So this was also in Chicago. This was a different place that I went. So it was a play area. It was a really cool play area, and I think I have some pictures from there in this lecture. But what was really interesting about it is you parked a ways away, and then you had this kind of long walk to get to the play area. So it kind of took you, that whole idea of immersion, it took you away from your regular life. It took you away from your car. It took you away from your parking lot, right? Because you were walking through, and this is what it felt like. This is the space that you were walking through. So you were walking through, it was an old farm. So you're walking through this old farm landscape with these grasses and farm fences and things like that. So it was taking you away from that experience. And then they hid these little things to discover in the landscape. So this is like a little tiny raccoon, a little stuffed raccoon they stuck in the bush here. And then this, I think, was a little miniature skunk. So you're walking away from your car. You're getting surrounded by just this kind of, farm environment that's returning to a natural landscape. And then you have these little things that are kind of leading you forward, that are immersing you in that experience. So you're immersed in this idea, in this experience of nature. It's definitely a human, a human-oriented nature. But you're also starting to get pulled into this idea of play, right? Step by step. This was a little squirrel. He was in the tree too. It was magical. And it took you away from that parking area. Oh, this is from the play area. So part of it for children, of creating an immersive environment, is not just about the big experience of immersion, it's little tiny things to discover. So an immersive environment should have things that you don't discover unless you slow down. Because part of what you need to do to immerse people is you need to get them to slow down. You need to get them to be in the moment, in the place, and you need to get them to move more slowly. So, if all that you're giving people is stuff that you can experience by moving quickly through it, that is not an immersive environment. If that was, driving to work would be an immersive experience, which it's not, right? You have to slow down, and then there has to be things that you're like, oh my goodness, what is that over there? Oh my goodness, what is this over here, right? And so doing things like embedding these kinds of symbols in the pavement, or in this case, they had these, they had like deer prints and bear prints, all different kinds of fauna from the area that they had embedded in the concrete. And then they had signs elsewhere where you could get information on what that species was, right? So if you think back to those stages of development, that middle stage, 10 to 12, where it's cognitive, right? So the cognitive development, you give them a hint that something interesting is going on, and then you lead them to wanting to know more about that thing, which is the cognitive development. This is this idea of encouraging exploration. So we talked about, or not really, no, we didn't talk about that yet. So this idea of the mystery of something around the corner that you can't see, which we'll talk about next class-ish or something, I can't remember when. Next class or the class after. This idea of hiding something around the corner and kind of encouraging exploration. So it needs to encourage exploration. You need to be able to see for a certain distance, and then you need to stop being able to see what's around the corner. Okay, that's the defining characteristic. This was actually one of my students from a long time ago, working with these kids. So getting them to collect different leaves and then looking at the shapes of the leaves and the colors of the leaves and figuring out which leaves were from the same tree and which leaves were from different trees, right? So that idea of classification. And this is that space with the mounds, but from a different angle. So this is the Regenstein Children's Garden. That's what it was. This is the Regenstein Children's Garden. So these are the mounds of grass, and then behind the mounds of grass were these tunnels. So these are wooden tunnels with these logs. So it's a play area. It's not, it would be better if it had more loose parts to it, but it still has a lot of affordances associated with it, right? You climb through it, you climb over them, you climb under them, you go around them, right? There's more opportunities. They're more open to interpretation. And then you have these little things to discover as well, right? So little tiny spaces like the always popular treehouse, the forts, right? The caves and niches for kids to go on their own or just with one other person. So this is the same space. This is Regenstein, which is one of my favorite play areas for kids. And they actually have this, it's like this whole arbor infrastructure that's actually a tunnel that you can go in and run around and through it. And one of my favorite children's gardens is in northern England. It's called the Anwick Garden in northern England. And what they have, so we went there, and it's a very long story that I won't tell the whole story, but the Duke of Northumberland, so this was the Duke of Northumberland's land. The Duke of Northumberland passed away. He died. And he didn't have any kids, so his younger brother got the property. So the Duke of Northumberland is a very powerful person in England. So his younger brother, who never expected to have to be the Duke, you know, he was like 30 at the time or something happened to his brother. So he became the Duke. He had a young wife, and he had 3 kids. And so his young wife, the Duchess of Northumberland, she identified this piece of land and said, I would like to build a garden there for the public. And he said, well, sure, you know, if it'll keep you busy. And so she built Anwick Gardens. And Anwick Gardens are, it is absolutely amazing. And when I was there, they weren't even finished, and they were already having 300,000 visitors a year. And when we talked to the Duke, he was like, yeah, it serves me right. For saying if it'll keep you busy. So when we talked to the Duchess, so the Duchess, very cool lady, and just really young, like has young kids, you know, she was in her 30s or 40s, and she said, okay, I wanted to create spaces for children to play. And she said, so I went to my landscape architects. She worked with a team of landscape architects on the project. And she said, I went to them and I said, okay, design me some spaces for children, you know. And so they came up with these gardens that were, you know, gardens that were about vegetables you could grow and flowers you could grow. And I guess she looked at the drawings and she was like, oh my God, that is so boring. My kids would be like, so boring. And she said, I do not want gardens that are about things that make you healthy. She said, I want gardens about things that'll kill you. Those are way cooler. So she actually had them build a poison garden that was just plants that would kill you. And then she had all the educational stuff around what these plants were, digitalis, and it's for your heart, and all of this kind of stuff. And of course, they had to have a staff person there all the time so the kids didn't eat the plants. But it was such a great idea. This idea of like, what is it that's really cool for kids, and how do we provide that? And then tying that. Right? So it had opportunities for the kids to touch things and feel things, which was sensory motor, and then it had opportunities for them to learn about things, which is that 10 to 12-year-old range that you really want, right? And it was the experience of the prison, or of the poison garden, was like this. It was this low enclosure that you had to kind of duck down to get in, so it felt really hidden, and it was all black and purple, and you had to kind of, you know, it was like all low for kids, so you felt out of place as an adult, right? But that's what makes some of these experiences so fabulous, and that was part of what made it immersive. It was a great idea, but it also addressed the different learning styles, addressed the different age groups, and very specifically was designed to appeal to children and to exclude adults from the experience, which makes it even more cool, right? So these small spaces. Oh, and you need to let kids get up high and go down low. This whole idea of this stupid railing and the accessible play area, and make the railing higher and make the railing higher and make the railing higher so that the kids won't jump off of things. It's like, for goodness sakes, just design things for kids to climb up, you know? Look at that kid. He is having the time of his life. It's like, if you just design it so that there clearly is something for him to climb up, and that he is going to feel like he wants to have some parental support there to do it, everybody is going to be happier, right? And then you also want to have spaces where they're going to climb through and under. I think I have some photos, right? So here, right? So up high. I really need to. So up high, right? Up high. Look at these kids. They're up on the rock, right? Up high. Here, up, climbing up on this rock, up high. Climbing up on this rock, up high. Climbing up on this rock, up high. You see? It's like this is one of those great mysteries for me. It's like, why then do I look at people's designs who are designing things for children and they have nothing to climb on? It's like, look at all of these kids. That's what they want to do. They want to climb on things. And it's a good thing for them to climb on things, right?
Did you have to go to kind of like butt heads against people? Like, how do you convince them?
Well, mostly I don't even talk about it as something for kids to climb on. I'm like, oh, the rocks, and they're so great, and they're sculptural, and it's so exploratory in nature, and you give the message to the adults that the adults need to hear in a way that sells the things that the kids are going to want.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't bother trying to convince them that falling is good or hurting themselves. Yeah, no, I'm just like, oh, your children really need to, the muscle mass and learning and seeing the world in different ways, and these days nature, you just use nature, right? It's like, oh, the natural surfaces and being able to climb and learn and blah, 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 right? And then these down low spaces, these little spaces below things, under things, right? In here, this is somewhere here in California, I can't remember now, but anyways, going under here, also climbing up here. Woo, those look fun. I would totally climb on those. I was in Morocco for 6 weeks, like 4 years ago or something. I was there on a Fulbright, and in the capital city is a mosque that's dedicated to the father of the current president of Morocco, and there are these columns. There's like these forests of columns that are like really high over your head that are symbolic of something in his life. I've never really got an answer as to what the columns were symbolic of. And people, all of these people from all of these different religions and all of these different cultures all climbed up those columns, right? So they're like this. And so there were I should put a picture in here. All of these columns with people and their children all sitting on top of all of these columns in this religious place, right? And so people wearing full Islamic garb, full Muslim garb, and then Westerners, and like all of these people all climbing this universal interest in changing the way you can see the world by getting up high, right? And it was just so powerful. But here's a little guy sitting up on top there. I designed a project once. We had a really big frog. So we did a plate. It was a splash pad. Do you guys know what a splash pad is? So it was a splash pad. So it had ground-mounted heads that would shoot water up if you did the right thing. And we had rocks kind of embedded in it. And I think we used a pattern of like water lilies on the surface and stuff, and we had this great big frog in the middle of it, and that every kid that could possibly climb that frog would climb the frog, and it's just this human need to get up and above things and see the world in a different way, and then also to climb underneath, right? So getting away by themselves or with one other person, creating these little spaces for them. So this is also interesting. I want to make sure we don't run out of time. You guys seem to be more awake now. That's good. So this is Regenstein again. This is the Chicago Children's Garden. So one thing that we do is we design these water features for children. And these days, of course, we have all these liability issues around water features. They're almost as bad as water liability issues around climbing up on top of things. And one of the things that I talked about during even the first lecture, I talked about the power of water for us as humans, right? Water and trees, water and trees, water and trees. And this water feature here, you can actually see the children in the background. This water feature was hugely popular. In fact, this was more popular than those grassy mounds. And It's basically just a brick area here down below, and then they've created these large kind of flagstone pieces that kind of overlap it, so it's got a little bit of a lip underneath, and then there's just like this much water. Tiny little amount of water there. Just enough water that if you walk through it, it splashes, right? But by making the space that you could walk through here, like 18 inches wide or something, it meant that kids could do it on their own. It made it a space that gave them permission to play in the water on their own. They could also play with a group like these guys are doing here, right? You create this more of a watering hole experience, right, by putting the rock there and creating some space around the rock to kind of encourage more people. But by making this only 18 inches deep, it means you can do that by yourself. This is another one. This is a different space, but it's the same kind of thing. You create this small water area that then encourages kids to kind of explore it by themselves and play by themselves. Here's the mounds in the background, and here's that water feature right there. It runs underneath. So here's like a little flat bridge area, right? So it's basically flat area of concrete that goes over top of it. The water feature runs underneath that, so it goes through a culvert underneath there, and then it continues on, and it goes all the way through here. But because it's skinny, it's small, and it's only got a tiny bit of water in it, it's relatively inexpensive to build, right? And you can recycle the water if you want to, right? But you can see like this, see how few people are over here, and look how many people are right here. That's the power of water. And this is barely any water, but because it's this long, sinewy space, it creates lots of opportunities for people to interact with it, you know, as families, as family groups, as small groups, as individuals, right? And because it's got these kinds of zones around it here, it creates opportunities for parents to be able to see the kids without the kids feeling like the parents are right over top of them. I'll talk about that in a little bit more. You want to allow kids to pretend to be someone else. This is that whole idea of dramatic play. So you want to make sure, look what's right behind her, shrubs, right? So you need to make sure the space is enclosed. You need to provide the loose parts. So things like signs and sticks. If she didn't have the sign, if she had a stick, she would pretend she had a sign, right? And things that they can then convert that provide opportunities for them. This picture always cracks me up because this could have been me as a kid. I was such a brat as a kid. Anyways, my brother was like perfect and I was impossible. Anyways, and bossy. Okay, so this is like the whole that idea of the relational and the classification, right? Is letting kids discover, oh, you know, this small thing full of rocks is really heavy, but this small thing full of bubbles is really light. And this is that idea of unobtrusive watching. So you want the kids to feel safe, right? You want them to feel safe that there's an adult nearby. And mostly that's not as much of a factor as you want the adults to feel safe because they're nearby. You know, it's more about the adults than it is about the kids. But you need the adults not to be right on top of the kids. For the kids to learn those kinds of social skills and the conflict management and how to negotiate things, you need to not have a parent right there to step in. You need the kids to feel like they are working this out for themselves. And so you want to design so that if the kids are over here, the parents are over here, and they're close enough that they feel like they know what's going on, but the kids feel like they are figuring this out for themselves and they don't have to go to the parents. So, ideally you want the seating to be comfy. So this is an example here, right? So the kids can be up here playing. Here's the water feature that runs behind here, right? There's the kid right there, and here's the parents. So you want them to be close enough that the parents feel comfortable, but far enough away that the kids feel independent. And then you want spaces to feel safe without feeling enclosed. And this is Regenstein again. This is where my true inner geek comes to the surface, okay? Is things like, oh my goodness, they did such a good job of designing the fencing, right? But it's small things like this. So what they did at Regenstein is so the pathway was up here like this. They had a slope down like this. And then they had a fence, this fence. And then they had a slope up, and then they had vegetation, and then it went slope down again, and then that was where the children were playing. So for the parents, this fence meant that anybody who was wanting to kind of come in and do things they shouldn't be doing was going to be absolutely obvious, right? But the fence was subtle. Unless you were really looking for the fence, you did not know the fence was there. So the parents felt safe because they realized there was a fence there without it saying, hi, this space is fenced. So I'm going to show you some more images of this because I thought this particular choice of fence with the vegetation right up against it. So instead of framing the fence, just making the fence part of that vegetation was just such a wonderful way of making people feel safe and letting the parents step away a bit from the kids. There's the fence. It's right in here. Right? So if I'm a stranger over here and there's kids playing here, those kids really are safe. That fence doesn't need to be really high because it's not about keeping me out. It's about making me have to be noticeable to get in. Right? I can walk. If I walk into a space, I'm not necessarily going to be noticeable. If I'm coming to a space and I have to do this to get over the fence, you're going to notice me, right? So that's all you need, is you need enough of a barrier to make it noticeable when people climb it. Oh, there's more of those little guys. There's a little fox. Here's a little skunk. Here's another raccoon. I just love those. Okay. So, how are we doing for time? Just no time. No time. All right. What have we got on next week? Anybody know off the top of their heads? No, I'm just wondering what the lecture is for next week. Okay, so it is that one. All right. So next week is our kind of heaviest theory lecture. So Neil will take our video and send it to his assistant person that's in some other country. Neil is a software engineer, my husband. Google, thank you very much. Yes. So he will do magic to the video that I have no idea how it works, and then it will be posted on YouTube, and then I will send a link. So you guys will have access to the video as well. We'll make sure the people who weren't here will have access to the video. And then as of next week, I'm going to start prepping you guys for midterms, for the midterm, okay? Because for most of you, this is going to be the first time, especially for you, this is going to be the first time that you will have a midterm of this type, right? Because I will incorporate images where I'm asking you, what is this talking about? I will ask you to give me a scenario. And I found last semester that having the students, giving them a series of questions to work through really, really helped in terms of prepping. So the students did a fantastic job of really digging their way into the material with my support for that. So we'll start doing that next week. Other than that, does anybody have any questions? I know I owe you guys some material back with comments. I will be doing that as quickly as I possibly can. Anybody have any other questions? We're good. All right, so we have our midterms are the week of March 10th, I think. So we are 2 weeks out. Is that right? Yeah, we've got 2 weeks and then we'll have midterms. All right, so yeah, so we'll start prepping for midterms next week. So starting next week, I'll be giving you guys index cards. You'll be writing up questions. I actually use the questions that you write in the midterm. So anybody who comes up with a question that I incorporate in the midterm gets a 1% bonus on their final grade, straight up. So if you write an excellent question and I put it in there, you get that. I had a student last semester get something like 8% bonus on their final grade because I used 8 of their questions. So they wrote some really good questions. So keep that in mind. We'll be doing that starting next week. And other than that, I will get you guys your comments back as quickly as possible. So keep your eye on your emails. Okay? Anything else? All right. Thank you, folks.